Good evening, everybody. My name is Eve Wagner. I am a mediator and arbitrator at Signature Resolution, and I want to welcome you to Curb Bad Behavior Part 2, Preventing Sexual Harassment from a Male Perspective. So some of you may be wondering, why is this Curb Bad Behavior Part 2? What was Part 1? So Part 1 we held at the Museum of Tolerance probably about 6 months before the pandemic. And that focused on preventing sexual harassment from start to finish. We had a couple of therapists and psychologists on who talked about how to nip harassment in the bud starting in elementary school. So what things to focus on and notice so you don't have some little one grow out to be a Harvey Weinstein. And we took that all the way to the finish line, which was filing a lawsuit. So we decided to do something a little different this time and focus on the male perspective. And from a couple of vantage points. One, what can men do to help stop harassment? And secondly, men, of course, are harassed as well as women. And so we wanted to talk about that as well, why men don't report, and some of the additional challenges that men have when presenting a case to a jury. So we have a very esteemed panel on. I could let everybody introduce themselves, but in the interest of time, we have some plaintiffs' trial lawyers on here, David deRubertis and Martin Ahrens are both leading plaintiffs' trial lawyers in employment. And we have John Barber, who's driving, so he might lose us for a few seconds before he gets back on, who's a leading employment defense attorney. We also have David Phillips. He is a co-mediator with me at Signature Resolution. We have Juan, there you are, who worked in a law firm and now works in the financial industry. And we have Meredith Rossi, who is a therapist who's going to start us off by talking about why men don't report. So I'm going to turn this over to Meredith.
Okay. So first of all, I want to introduce myself. I actually worked, in addition to being a therapist, I also worked in software for a number of years. And so I bring together my unique experience in the workplace, in corporate for a number of years, in a particularly male-dominated industry of software, and being a female in that industry, as well as my unique perspective as a therapist. I think before I talk about why men don't report, I think it's important to define what is sexual harassment. And since I am talking to a group of esteemed lawyers, I figured I would start with Catherine Frank. She is the James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia University. She's also the lead scholar on law, race, and religion. And she wrote a paper in the Stanford Law Review in 1997 titled, "What is Wrong with Sexual Harassment?" And she looked at sexual harassment as a tool of sexism, one that perpetuates, enforces, and polices a set of gender norms that seek to uphold these norms, which is basically feminize women and masculinize men. So what's interesting is she proposes that women are harassed because our culture establishes these sex role stereotypes and norms that subordinate women. However, she also argues that men are harassed in order to punish those who deviate from their expected masculine roles and stereotypes, again, to reinforce this patriarchal value. So what's important also to note is that often sexual harassment is motivated more by control and domination than actual sexual desire, which again, in the context of Catherine Frank's definition, makes a lot of sense. It's about controlling the narrative and dominating, in terms of making sure that these values are upheld. So I also looked at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it does include that harassment does not necessarily have to be of a sexual nature. And can include offensive remarks about a person's sex. And that's what we're going to look at today, and how that plays into a man maybe not reporting. So again, it's about dominating, humiliating, and often men are targeted as a target of harassment or bullying for not being sufficiently masculine. So one interesting piece that I looked into when I was researching this is that in the 1980s and 90s, researchers found that there was a great deal of underreporting by men, and they looked at some of the research tools that were being used. And what they discovered is that many of these were designed to measure women's experiences of harassment. And they argued that those measures did not adequately account for what men deemed as unwanted sex experiences or harassment. So when we look at the types of behaviors that men tend to report as being harassing in the workplace, it's really, again, about them not living up to these gender roles. So you're not man enough. And often we see this in, specific types of workplaces. Maybe, some are male dominated. Also being told offensive or dirty jokes or stories, or, somebody showing a picture on their phone. And it being part of a joke, and that person being harassed for not engaging in that behavior. Or maybe an opposite sex coworker or supervisor saying, oh, men only have one thing on their mind, or, hey, I bet you're only thinking, you're looking at her ass, or maybe you're looking at her, you only have one thing on your mind. So it can definitely happen from a female to a male, basically, again, looking at that male as, as perpetuating a stereotype. So men are targeted for not meeting their gender stereotypes. And you can imagine that this definitely occurs not only for straight men, but obviously for men that are LGBTQ. So again, although both the males experience this sexual coercion, this unwanted attention, maybe lewd comments, men they uniquely consider being punished for deviating from their gender roles as harassing. So we also, I also looked at some studies that talked about, that pointed to the fact that men are often harassed in the workplace by other men. And so because men are generally in, positions of power, the men that are being harassed by other men may perceive this as more threatening. And men may consider harassment by a woman to be trivial or fun. Being harassed by another man is threatening, to their identity. And then to add to this, men who are being harassed by homosexual men, again, in this culture, men tend to be more homophobic than women. So this can be particularly threatening. So why they don't report? I'm an adjunct professor at Pepperdine, and I teach a class on trauma. And one thing that we look at is, war trauma and secondary trauma as being not just the trauma they experienced, maybe overseas, but the secondary trauma of, suck it up, right? You don't report, you don't go to therapy, you don't talk about this. It's basically this sort of masculine attitude about sucking it up. Or maybe it starts out as joking or playing around and then escalates to something more. There's also this idea that you're a man and you should be able to protect yourself from harassment, or that maybe harassment doesn't happen to men, or that you shouldn't be bothered by a woman coming on to you or groping you. You should feel good about it. And then, of course, a retaliation in the workplace by other men. So what happens is we see that men who do report or do take a more active role, they're confronting, maybe they're not only standing up for themselves or somebody else, they face retaliation specifically in that's unmanly behavior. And even the idea of complaining right? Like, oh, complaining, that's something that women do. That's not something men do. They suck it up, like we're tough. And so these gender roles can also encourage men to value and invite sexual advances from women. And again, be a man. This is what you want. So again, going back to this point, many forms of workplace harassment and aggression are, accepted as part of the male character. And so you can see the sort of confusing nature is like, should I report? Is this harassment? But, maybe historically I've been taught to, like, I'm supposed to enjoy this. This is supposed to be part of like camaraderie. And so, men should seek out and enjoy sexual encounters, and any deviation from that is seen unfavorably. Also, the idea that there's a sense of kinship through this exchange of dirty jokes or, dirty pictures, or the celebration of behaviors that objectify others, women or people from the LGBT community. And even that like antisocial put downs that occur between them, a lot of them, is joking and demasculinizing the target. They're also embarrassed to report any harassment, and they fear maybe that they will not be believed. And there was an interesting article I read about asking the question, are men who report harassment viewed less compassionately? So in November of 2020, the researchers, I guess they looked at probably 850 participants. They surveyed them. 56% were female, 44 were male. And they basically gave them a few vignettes to read, and they described different types of harassment between two coworkers. And sometimes the victim was male, and sometimes the victim was a female. But what they found is when the male was actually the victim of harassment, they were viewed less favorably, and they elicited less sympathy than their female counterpoints. And also that male victims were believed to have suffered less, and thus requiring less time to recover. And so we know that harassment of any kind in the workplace, just, regardless of your gender, has a psychological impact. And we see anxiety, we see depression, we see anger, we can see loss of confidence, relationship issues. Maybe somebody comes home from work where they're being harassed. Maybe they project out onto their family, or they become quiet, loss of sleep, disordered eating. So lots of impact on, on the target, the victim. So that's really my presentation on this. I hope that was informative and helpful. It's about broadening our idea of what is sexual harassment and looking at it, specifically how men and women view it differently.
Thank you, Meredith. So has anybody on this panel, other than Meredith or me, been sexually harassed or know anybody close to them that was?
Well, I do, Eve. I have a friend who I reached out to him because I wanted to find out if he's been sexually harassed. I'm a gay male who's worked in corporate for 22 years, and I've never personally been harassed, but he told me a story, and I want to share that with you. So if I can read that to you, would that be all right?
Sure.
So basically, my friend stated, I worked at a workers' compensation immigration law firm located in San Gabriel about 4 years ago. I was in charge of the call center department and was considered a lead. The managing partners did not like to use the word supervisor as it sounded more superior to them. As the lead, I was to meet with them once a week on Mondays and discuss any issues within the department. The people who were in the meeting were both managing partners who were straight white men and their father-in-law, who was our HR. At the time of being employed, I had my partner working with me, and in one occasion while having our weekly meeting, I was asked by one of the partners, who takes it from behind? They all started to laugh, and one of them said that I look like the dominant kind and my partner does not. I was shocked, as I had never experienced something like this. I tried to switch the conversation up by addressing some issues in the department, but I was shut down and their humor continued. I walked out of that office confused, but mostly angry because I did not speak up. The last incident I had with them was when I was in another meeting with the same individuals, and I was asked, who wears the pants in the relationship? I replied by saying, what does it matter? We both get the job done, and was then told that my partner now gives a dominant vibe, so I may be the submissive one. I ended the meeting by asking if we were actually going to talk about work or if my sex life and homosexuality will be the point of topic. I was asked to leave the meeting, and they said they were just joking around. So,
Do you know if he reported it to anybody or took any action, or he just did what a lot of people do, which is grin and bear it and move on?
Grin and bear it and move on. Considering that HR was the partner's father-in-law, I mean, basically, if you were to report it to HR, it would be brushed under the table. So when he told me this, I was very shocked, and reading it just now got me very angry because coming from more of a conservative legal background, I just would not. I would experience this, and I would, go to an attorney, and I would just file a case. But to have someone, and he's much younger than I am as well, so he was in his 20s. So when you're in your 20s, you kind of feel that if you're being harassed, where do you go and who do you turn to? So when I was reading this, I really just felt that I don't know how I would have reacted if I had worked in this kind of environment in my 20s compared to my 40s now, where I'm more comfortable with who I am.
So let me turn this over to the plaintiff's lawyers in the room. Have you represented any men in a sexual harassment case? And if so, can you sort of talk about what some of the challenges are, and whether there was retaliation, things like that?
You want to start off? Go for it.
Go ahead. Age before beauty, David. Go ahead.
I have, and I've handled a number of sexual harassment cases involving male plaintiffs. They've ranged from a female harasser to a straight male harasser to a gay male harasser, and I think they've run that sort of gamut. It's interesting because I definitely think that there's more of a challenge. Well, let me step back. They've all sort of shared in common failures to report on what we would think is a timely basis. And I've anecdotally definitely seen that the failure to reporting and the reasons that Meredith described were completely there. It's interesting. I wrote down as Meredith was presenting, men perceive harassment by a gay harasser more threatening. And I had never thought about that before, but that actually, and it's interesting because I think it's part of what needs to be corrected in our society and part of the underlying problem. But that anecdote played out, I realized, in my cases. I've had more cases that fit that fact pattern than the other fact patterns. And I think it's interesting because that really was fascinating to me. It shows that sort of some of the problems that, how do we fix the problem going back to? I think we need to fix the problem of the underlying issues. I was thinking about the discussion, and when young adults go away to college and their socialization in college is a fraternity house where we drink as much as we can and we get everybody to drink as much as we can to who knows? I mean, things like this, I think, have to be part of the discussion of how to change the culture in order to fix the problem. Because I don't know how a young male adult gets into a workplace and all of a sudden, the behavior just changes. For what it's worth, I'd be curious to see what others think. I don't want to keep going. Let me turn it over to Martin. I do have more thoughts on presenting these cases and stuff, but let me turn over to Martin.
Yeah, I think David is right. And what I've noticed in where the victim has been a male is, and Meredith hit on it, like it's not about sex, it's about power. And it's about domination. There was a case recently of Pearl versus the city of Los Angeles, which was a male sanitation worker whose coworkers were making homophobic slurs towards him, even though he was not a gay man. And they edited some pictures about him to show him in, sexual positions. And it was he reported it and he complained about it in that case. And then the employer didn't do anything about it, resulted in a very large verdict. And so I think one of the hard parts that I've observed for both male jurors in any type of sexual harassment case and then male sexual harassment victims is, I know this is me, one of the hardest things for me to do is to put myself in the shoes of my clients, the young woman who's been sexually assaulted, and to why didn't why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you do anything? That male machismo, if you will, of, well, I would have punched him in the face. And it's hard to understand the fear and the frozenness that goes through a young woman's mind or a young man's mind when you are being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed. And so the only way to sort of, we all know about it and understand it and can empathize and sympathize because we go to these seminars and we talk to our clients and we listen to them and we deal with our clients' therapists to try to truly understand and relate how shocking it is to the system and how just fragile you are when you're in that moment and you can't do anything. And that's the power dynamic. And that's the, I can't believe this is happening. How is this happening? Why is this happening? What do I do? And while your mind is racing, you are being sexually harassed, sexually assaulted. And so when we talk about, preventing sexual harassment from the male perspective, what I think is important, and I think David wanted to talk about this too, is somehow educating each other and then, mediators or defense counsel and then jurors, like what that feels like. And what we focus on when we're trying to convey that is and Shannon, my partner, she kind of boiled this down for me beautifully is, you focus on the five senses. What did she see? What did he hear? What were the smells? Was there alcohol in his breath, right? Was it cold? What was the touch? And so when you start thinking about that, like Juan's situation of that man in the conference room, right? I bet you if you asked him, he could close his eyes and tell you where everyone's sitting, what the food was on the table, what was going on, how the hairs on his arms stood up. And it's only, I think, when we understand that power dynamic and those five senses, if you will, that we can truly begin to, from a male perspective, understand and educate.
So from John, I don't know if you're still driving, but from a defense attorney, have you handled these types of cases as well?
Sure. Yeah. They are statistically still anomalous, but, going back to your very first question and kind of trying to touch on everything, you said, does anybody know anybody close to them who's been harassed? And I'd like to think that there is an age below which perhaps there are women who have not been. But as a brother to three sisters, a father to three daughters, I've been surrounded by women my entire life. And I don't know any woman, certainly over 30, who hasn't been subjected to inappropriate behavior, obviously on a wide spectrum, some of it horrific, some of it less significant in its gravity. But there are two thoughts that occurred to me as we were getting ready for this presentation. The first is, we talk about curbing bad behavior. There's the approach that we can take from a legal perspective, which is the stick. And then there's the cultural aspect. The only way it's going to change, and David deRubertis touched upon this, is in a far broader societal and cultural manner, well beyond both my expertise and my ability to influence it. But if you view the workplace from the perspective of a family and specifically from the perspective of a parent, as my son is getting out of the car right now, if you tell your children to do as you say, not as you do, we all know what happens, right? They do exactly what you've done and they ignore what you say. The same thing is exactly true in the workplace. And I've seen this for 30 years as a lawyer. If the culture is rife with inappropriate, let's just say jocularity, which is too kind of word, but inappropriate references, misogynistic behavior, whether subtle or overt, etc., then no matter what your policies are, no matter what you're saying as the managerial influence in the workplace, it's what you're doing that's going to permeate the workplace. And the only way to curb that behavior is to ensure that the culture actually embraces an environment in which people feel safe. And the one thing that I have found that resonates with other men who, again, as David deRubertis said, like I did, I went to school, was in a fraternity and came up through that world. What resonates with them is if you can get through to them, to men, this notion of not feeling safe, that the women in the workplace don't feel safe. They don't want to come to work. And when they begin to view their workplace as an environment in which it's their responsibility to ensure that everybody feels fostered, developed, supported, and there's a sense of empathy, then you begin to see the cultural change. But until you can accomplish that, the only other methodology is the stick, which is you got to sue the crap out of them and make people pay, and eventually they'll change their behavior.
And David, from your perspective as a neutral, I'm sure you've mediated numerous cases like this, and also from your personal experience. Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I've done actually, I would say a ton of cases like this. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know that there's kind of one size fits all, because what I've noticed is really what happens and how it's experienced and how people complain about it or don't complain about it is really different. So for instance, when you have, so I've had that exact case of a group of straight coworkers harassing another straight coworker. It was usually, I've had that case like 3 times. They've all been blue collar environments. And the way the victim of that feels is very ashamed and very degraded and very physically intimidated. And so they present a certain way. On the other end of the spectrum, there's gay male harassing gay male. And then that's kind of more similar to when we see, let's say straight male harassing a woman. And so there's like this very broad spectrum of how people react to it and how they perceive it and whether or not they report it even.
And what about trying these cases? What particular challenges are there? And, society, obviously there's stereotypes. So, when the Disclosure movie first came out, I think with Demi Moore and Michael Douglas, there was a ton of discussion about it. And I remember men joking at the law firm I was working about, it's like, if I'd like to be harassed by her too. So there's these stereotypes and ideas that I am sure jurors have. So anybody want to jump in and talk about the challenges, both on the defense side and on the plaintiff side of trying these types of cases?
I'll jump in. It's interesting. I think they are more challenging in the sense, obviously, because whenever something is not fitting into the norm, it's more challenging, right? But I also think that in terms of handling these cases, and I bet Martin would agree, from my perspective as a plaintiff lawyer, I just think it's more important in a male victim of harassment case that the things we normally do as plaintiff and employment lawyers we're doing in that case. What do I mean by that? The case isn't about the harassment. It's about the employer that didn't give a darn and didn't prevent it and didn't react properly. The case is usually more about the retaliation than it is about the underlying harassment. It's sort of the same tools that we use. And I've always said, look, I mean, in jurors' eyes, yes, there's strict liability in California for supervisor harassment. Doesn't mean in jurors' eyes they agree with that. Doesn't mean a juror follows that rule if they don't feel it's morally and just fair, basically. So, from my perspective, the number one thing about trying these cases that fit a little bit outside the box is focusing on the employer more and focusing on the power dynamic. Look, if I've got a case where there was rampant harassment, ignored by employer, not properly investigated, and retaliation happens, the jury's going to get over that initial reaction of it's a male victim when the case is framed that way. What's also interesting, though, I think, and we can touch about this, I know we'll talk a little bit about transgender cases later, and I think this really applies, but it also applies in a male victim of harassment case, which is that anytime the fact pattern, anytime the discriminatory mindset is a little bit more accepted in society, I actually think jury selection's easier. So it's very easy to get somebody on that panel talking about, gee, I don't think, some old school, let me just say, rather than a derogatory term, some sort of old school view of, oh, I don't think a male can be hurt by that. It's very easy to get that answer in jury selection. And now I can use it to get others talking, and I can see the reaction of others if we don't have masks over their faces, which will be an issue. But in that sense, I think that trying this kind of case is almost easier in a sense that it's easier to spot the jurors you don't want. I learned that like back in 2006, I tried a sexual orientation harassment case, male on male. My client was gay. The supervisor, we didn't know his sexual orientation. And as an aside, I think that sexual orientation doesn't actually matter in terms of the harasser. And I think we get into a mistake worrying about the orientation. But in that case, it was very easy to see who was not going to give a plaintiff verdict because the bias in 2006 in a conservative venue against my gay plaintiff was very apparent. So I think in some sense, the more acceptable societally the bias is, the easier it is to figure that out in jury selection.
Yeah, and I think John and David kind of had the right idea about what the culture is in the environment. I've yet to see a sexual harassment victim where they were the only victim. Typically, the person that is the harasser has engaged in some type of harassing conduct towards others previously. And sometimes what happens is they get away with a little bit on victim one. And then on victim two, they get a little bit more aggressive. And then it kind of goes on. And so that goes back to the culture comment that John was talking about how the work environment is and if it's allowed. And so I think that what I've observed is anytime I've had a sexual harassment case, the first thing we look for is other victims, because I've yet to find a case where there truly was a one-off of harassment. I'm sure there have been some, maybe like where a consensual relationship turned sour might be the only instance I could think where that might be a one-off type of thing, but that's a different case with a different set of headaches. But from the male perspective, like a lot of times what I've seen is some of the, there's two types of witnesses in those cases. There's the other victims, and then there's I heard that. Like I can confirm that he said those things. And I think unfortunately, like you get back to the locker room culture, like some of the things that Meredith was talking about, and it's that some men are unwilling to step forward and to testify against other men, even though they've seen some of those things. And so building a relationship with those other witnesses and trying to reach out to them and pointing out to them, like John was saying, he's got sisters and daughters. I've got a mother and sister and daughter and wife and all those things. And like, I think a lot of times when you relate to other men who are a little hesitant on the, put yourself in this woman could be your sister, could be your daughter, could be your, you know, your best friend's wife, your wife. Sometimes it hits home and they're able to speak out against it in support of you or even at the workplace.
So John and David, do you find so on the defense side and from the neutral's perspective, when you're defending these cases or mediating these cases, how the clients, you know, the company's reaction is when they hear this is a male on male or a female harassing a male?
From a neutral perspective.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Well, I was just going to say, from a neutral perspective, what I've found is people can be more, you know, the same biases that you're going to find in a jury pool, you find with people who are just on the defense side working for companies. So, you know, if they are presumptively distrustful of certain kinds of, you know, harassment, that is an issue. The other thing is, and I don't know if the plaintiff folks have found this, but you got to explain the damages sometimes a little better, because they're not predisposed to seeing those, you know, and it's very specific. So that's what I've noticed.
I wouldn't say that there's a material difference in your assessment of a defense client, whether it's a male victim or a female victim, or really what the nature of the legal theory is. The big distinction from a defense perspective is volume of experience that your client representative has. So if this is a small entrepreneurial enterprise and this is the first lawsuit, it's a whole different attorney-client relationship than it is if you're dealing with an institutional client that has an in-house risk management and legal team. In the latter instance, they're going to be viewing it irrespective of whether it's male victim, female victim, or whatever. They're going to be viewing it from a very analytical, dispassionate standpoint. They're going to be looking at it from economic risk, as I said, risk management, and you're going to be talking about your chances of prevailing in math modeling and things of that nature. If it's a less experienced litigant, you've got a much more emotional reaction. And in that instance, I suppose you are going to be, I don't suppose, I know you are dealing with the biases of oftentimes the owner. So there, if you run into somebody who is homophobic or just emotionally stunted in their development, yeah, that's going to factor into the way I defend the case. Absolutely. Because I mean, obviously not going to tell you any specifics, but I've settled at least one trial I can think of at the top of my head after the owner testified, because he was unacceptable. His behavior was unacceptable on the stand. So that's what you're dealing with there. So yeah, if you had somebody who was going to say, "Oh, I can't believe this guy's claiming he got harassed. I wish I got harassed." Yeah, that's not somebody you're going to want to put on a stand in a courtroom.
I mean, it's funny because we have come a long way. I remember when I was an associate in a law firm, and that was a long time ago. There was really no case law on male harassment. And I went into a very senior partner's office because we had a male on male case. And he said, "There's no such thing." So I said to him, "Are you telling me that if you went to an associate and said, 'Hey, give me a blowjob,' or you're fired, that wouldn't be harassment?" And he's like, "No." Anyway, that case went to the California Supreme Court, Mogilevsky. So that really sort of started people recognizing in the legal circles anyway, that there was male on male harassment. But I have mediated numerous cases where I'm talking to the defense side, and the scoffing and the disbelief that, "Oh, well, he's not gay, so how he wouldn't have harassed so-and-so. That's ridiculous." Or, "She's a female harassing a male. Oh, come on. She can harass me anytime." And they just don't really get it. And the sexual harassment training, which is fantastic, and I'm glad we're doing it. And we have expanded it to coworkers and subordinates and all of that, but it doesn't really focus on this area. And then when you add this, now we have all kinds of, the transgender, non-binary. Have you seen anything or had any cases involving transgender?
I mean, I have.
Yeah, I have too.
Yeah.
So any additional challenges you see with that from either a settlement perspective, a defense perspective, or actually trying the case?
From a defense perspective, what's fascinating about that is we've gone just in the span of my career from what I used to refer to as the Jesse Helms rule, where it was specifically excluded, transgender status was specifically excluded from Title VII. There was no legal protection. I mean, I remember very distinctly on multiple occasions getting phone calls from clients who said that they had a transgender employee. And of course, the issue is always the bathroom. What are we going to do? And I remember that we always said, you don't have to worry about it because there's no legal protection. And fortunately, we've, as a society, have come a long way. And now the answer to those questions is markedly different. Now it's no, there's legal protection, and we've got to talk about how we're going to deal with this. So that is an area where the difficulty of trying to educate, because a lot of times that's what we're doing is we're educating, and I can't help but also inject my own personal beliefs into this. A lot of times I'm trying to assist a client in crafting a better culture. And that can be a real challenge. It can be a real challenge from the defense perspective to have to work with your clients to overcome a bias, which allows them to objectively evaluate the risk. Because if they bring a bunch of bias to the analysis process, I can't convince them that there even is the material risk that exists. So that, from a defense perspective, that's one of the real hurdles we have.
I mean, the hurdle in transgender cases is education. And I had a transgender case and we settled it at an MSC a week before trial. The hurdle in that case was, and this was probably 5-6 years ago, was convincing the judge, the MSC judge, at the beginning of the mediation that A, it was a protected activity, that B, that my client who was transitioning from male to female was allowed to dress in the gender identity and the gender expression that she preferred. And in that case, the owner of the place where my client worked, she had worked there for 15 years and then took a break and started transitioning. And the owner's response was, you can do whatever you want at nights and on the weekend, but when you're here, you're John. And that was undisputed. And there were emails and text messages that he had with his, wife and other coworkers of the owner. But I've yet to hear of a transgender discrimination retaliation case actually being tried. Like, I'm not aware that there's been a trial in the state of California on that issue, because I think the law is there and it's so unique that I think that there's still a lot of people that are biased against transgender people. And I think there are a lot of people that are very open-minded and understanding of it. And I think there's, from a trial perspective, just a lot of risk right now on in terms of who's your juror going to be, who's your judge, what it's going to look like. And the other issue is sometimes by the time you get to trial, your client has fully transitioned. And so they look and present as a woman or a man. But when they were going through that ordeal, it's called a transition for a reason. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a transition that takes, for some people, years. And when you're in the workplace and they're seeing that transition, I think is really when you get those types of derogatory comments and inappropriate questions about bathrooms, about dress, about do you like men? Do you like women? Like sexual orientation questions. And so I think that John talked about a lot of changes in our culture and in the legal career over the last 20 years. I think in the last 2 years, there have been a lot of changes in our culture, and I'm happy to see it. Personally, it makes me very happy that people are learning to accept people for just who they are and looking at them from this. And I hope that continues.
I've handled a good number of transgender cases, and I have a super soft spot, frankly, in my for them. And I will predict that in the next 5 years, we're going to see some massive transgender verdicts. I really believe that, and I think it's sort of the next and the most important current civil rights issue, or one of the most important. It's interesting though. I had one that was on the verge of being tried out back in October 2017 until, true story, I was onto it and realized the defendant was running a Ponzi scheme. And unfortunately, we were correct. He was running a Ponzi scheme and he's in federal prison now. So I don't get to try that case. But it was interesting. I went really far in the process, focus grouping, et cetera. And there's a place for proper justice in these cases. You've got to do everything right to get it there, though, I think. I personally believe this step number one for people for the bias to go away is you've got to sit down and speak to somebody who's lived an experience of being a transgender person. It is, every single client or potential client I've represented or looked at representing who's transgender, every single one has one of their first memories in life was realizing they just didn't feel right. And you sit down and you really experience and try to experience what somebody who's transgender has gone through to get to where they are now. And I'm sorry, I personally believe that you can't have a heart if that personal discussion doesn't get through to you of the obstacles this person has lived in life. I don't think you have a heart anymore. And I think we can figure out who doesn't have a heart in order to get a jury that's okay. But I think, same comments I was saying before is when you're handling either a transgender case or male on male or anything that's different, we've got to get through the first level of bias and we've got to get to the person we're representing. And for example, I think you've got to, and I meant to say this earlier and David Phillips had mentioned it, and it applies for transgender or for male on male cases. You've really got to be able to explain in a male on male case why your client was affected differently than the expectation of how a male would react. So I know I'm going away from transgender, going backwards, but I forgot this point earlier. I've got a case right now that's a male, a classic locker room, fraternity house workplace that's just despicable. And, there are a lot of men going along with the harassment that thought it was great and fun. And then my client just pulverized mentally. I mean, pulverized mentally in a way I've almost never seen from a client. And you sort of look at it on the surface and it's like, what, how do you have that reaction when many people participated, many people thought it was fine. And even those that even women in the workplace didn't get pulverized like my male client did from the same kind of conduct. And I can't explain now because the case hasn't been handled yet, or hasn't been tried yet. And there's a really good answer. But my point is overall, you've got to get into your client and understand your client's personal life story of how they got to that point to be able to understand why they were affected so much differently than society would think. So I think that in these kinds of cases, that's critical. And more so than any other kind, frankly.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have a question from the audience.
Eve, real quick, it looked like Juan wanted to add.
Oh, yes,
something.
Juan. Sorry.
Yes, Eve. As I'm listening to the conversations and from a gay perspective, I had read my friend's story. I just realized I worked at a major law firm about 20 years ago. And I and myself, and I think maybe about 14 other people were served with a summons and complaint by one of my coworkers in the records department for harassing him. And I guess I had it deep down inside that I just completely forgot about it. And basically, he stated that myself and attorneys, secretaries, as I recall back then, paralegals and other people in the records department, we had been harassing him. Basically, I think he was gay. I'm not sure. I think the worst thing I said was that he was strange. But when I received that summons and complaint, I was called to HR and told why I received it by this individual. I was so flummoxed. And seeing Meredith's slides, I went through the opposite in terms of I was angry, I just was resentful, and I would have to talk to this individual, and since we were served, he would just give me a snarky look, and I could not do anything about it because he was just waiting for somebody to do anything that he could file a lawsuit. And after that, I just said, you know what, I need to get out of here because I am not going to walk on eggshells when there's somebody who said I harassed them and I never did. And he is just waiting for all of us to do something so he can file that lawsuit. And it was just very strange because I just completely forgot about it until we just started talking and how all the other gentlemen were just talking about it. And so I just wanted to say I was charged with harassment, but I still, to this day, it's very confusing why. And I'm not sure if he wanted attention or if he was just, I don't know. I mean, he just maybe wanted to be left alone or I don't know. So that's one of the biggest things for me in the workplace that I did was charged with, not charged, but I was said I was harassing somebody.
No, thank you for sharing that. Let me just pose the question we got. This is, have you seen the number of settlements of these cases go down with the passage of CCP 1001? How are counsel and our mediators handling this?
I would not say that I've seen the number go down. What I've seen is a lot more pre-litigation negotiation, because the way the statute's read by I think all of us is that you can still have a confidentiality clause in a pre-claim, pre-admin posture. And so as a result, I think what you've seen is, and we really do, I mean, I think it's sort of incumbent upon everybody to be congratulatory about the skill set of other panelists when they're speaking, but Martin and David actually really are excellent plaintiffs lawyers. And so you see guys like that, men and women like that, who are astute, sending demand letters before they even file a DFVH complaint, so that they are very clear that the defendant can take advantage of confidentiality at that juncture. I would not say that all the cases still settle. I mean, cases that are going to settle are still settle. You either just do it earlier, or you have to be clever about the way you navigate around confidentiality.
I definitely haven't seen the cases go down.
Not at all. Not at all. But pre-lit for sure.
Mm-hmm. So let me transition this to the, which is obviously education is so important, because until we change this and people start understanding, and this goes for sexual harassment in general. And one of the goals of the Committee on Empowering Women is actually to involve men. It's in our mission statement, and that's because if all of us together start understanding what these issues are and how they actually impact everyone when you're harassed, maybe we can actually get somewhere. I've noticed a backlash since the Me Too Time's Up movement, which is upsetting. I noticed the same type of backlash. Again, I keep dating myself, but Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And I remember thinking, oh my God, we're really going to see some change. And maybe we did for a year or two, and then it got swept under the carpet for years and years and years and years because of the backlash. You hear people say, oh, I'm never going to go have lunch with a woman. I don't want to travel with a woman. I don't want to this. I don't want to that because she's going to accuse me. And it got swept under the rug until Me Too and Time's Up. And here we are again. And so I hear a lot of the backlash. So I just kind of wanted the panel's thoughts on how we really can curb bad behavior like this, what men can do to help prevent it, since we're talking about the male's perspective, both against women and men, the bystander concept, which is when you see it, say something. So those are things I just wanted to throw out to the panel and have a discussion about. Take it away, somebody.
I'll jump in. So I gotta say one thing I think, and this sounds silly, but I think it's true. I think we need to do a better job as parents. So I have this example in my, so I was raised by conservative parents. They were not civil rights. They didn't expect to have a liberal civil rights lawyer's son one day. I had a dad.
But who does? Who
Right.
wants to
My dad felt in his mind all his life long he was a county worker passed over promotion because he was a white male. Okay, so that's sort of where I came from, and I ended up a civil rights lawyer. In my house, I have, and it's funny. I as early as 2 years old, my daughter, between 2 and 3 years old, and it's not about it's analogous, but not the same exactly as what we're talking about. But she was 2 to 3 years old, we were already reading books about Martin Luther King. In my office, I had pictures of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, the mugshots. And I would bring her to the office and she would ask about the pictures. And we had books that she could read that matched the pictures. And, I think we did a really good job in our house of teaching our kids at a super young age that, to be colorblind in how you view people. And that was from intentionally doing it. Now, I think the same concept has to apply to how we raise our children when it comes to male-female issues and treatment of women. I joke, we have this joke, we've tried so hard to do this in our house that this is not a joke, that now whenever I ask my daughter to do anything basically in the house, she says, I'm a girl, I don't have to. Dylan, where's Dylan? Because we've so conditioned my son that you do for your sister. You treat her as a woman, or as we would want people to treat a woman in the workplace. So I would love to hear ideas from Meredith about how I get my daughter to pull her weight around the house. But I think this is just my example of how I think it has to start at home. I think it has to start there first to get everything to change one day.
Eve, actually, it's funny because I have transitioned from working in law firms after 20 years, and I work at a commercial real estate firm. And it's fascinating because the firm is actually all about embracing equality. We had a meeting last week, and their goal for the upcoming year is to hire more women to become partners and promote within, hire more people of different backgrounds, and actually last week they hired a temporary HR assistant who is non-binary, and they sent the HR sent out an email, and they used the words they used to describe her and to describe this person. They used they, them, and I've never seen that before, and I thought it was a step in. I mean, I'm very kind of just shocked by it, but I just feel that if more companies were to do this, where they just want to have people to be well and good employees, and they're just looking outside the box. So it's actually very interesting, and I'm very grateful to where I'm working now that they're doing this.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think dialogue and training are the sine qua non of change. It's dialogue and training, dialogue and training, dialogue and training. I'll tell you what's fascinating to me, and I've done some real soul searching on this. When Sanford Heisler and David and Martin might know those guys, but when they started filing their class actions against law firms, I imagine the shudder that went down the collective AmLaw 100 spine was probably audible. And everybody started taking a long look at their own, how many women are equity partners, what's our path to partnership, et cetera. And the theory that's advanced in the Sanford Heisler lawsuits that I find really difficult to wrap my brain around is this hidden bias that manifests in the retardation of progress of female partners. But then I've really tried to engage people in dialogue, particularly the women with whom I work, and tell me, what does that mean? How does that specifically manifest? And so I've begun to educate myself. And so, the old culture of the strip club, going out to a bar, marketing, or golf when it was statistically more likely that a man was going to play golf. These sorts of marketing encounters and marketing endeavors, which were either overtly or tacitly closed off to females, that's the only thing that I've been able to objectively understand. And I'm still trying to figure out where the other hidden or institutionalized biases could be. But I think that's the goal, right? The goal is I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about how I eliminate those roadblocks and how the path to ownership in a law firm and then any other institution is truly gender blind, gender neutral. And if people are thinking about it and they're talking about it, then we're going to knock those obstacles down. And so I would suggest to those that want to facilitate the knocking down of those obstacles, they need to participate in helping to educate the people with whom they work as to when those obstacles actually arise.
And I want to build upon what John said. Conversations, right? Panels, discussions, right? Having these type of talks. My background is actually in something called interpersonal neurobiology, which is really a fancy way of saying when we have conversations with other people, we make change, we elicit change. And so, our brains are these beautiful self-emerging properties. And I worked in traumatic brain injury, I worked in dementia care, and I believe very strongly in neuroplasticity. And so we can change thoughts, we can expand our view of what gender is, right? We can change the culture if we have conversations. And unfortunately, that is something that's been shut down a lot in this particular political, climate, is that we're not talking with people who we don't agree with. And that is not the way to, elicit change. So again, getting more information out there, talking to people, I think is incredibly important. That's how we are going to make change. That's how we're going to facilitate this change.
So one of the things I've noticed, we keep expanding the trainings. And I did both plaintiff and defense when I was practicing. And on the defense side, I did a lot of corporate trainings and sexual harassment trainings. And the frustrating thing about it was because it was mandatory, you'd get a group of people in the room. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to listen. They were scoffing that they had to do this. They're like, this is ridiculous. We know all this. And even though you try and make it engaging. So the trainings, while they're helpful, they don't seem to really, I don't think we've moved the dial, which is unfortunate. They do it so they can try and avoid liability when Martin and David file a lawsuit. So there's also the bystander idea, which I think is really important, which is if you're in a group and you see some guy you're making some obnoxious comments about somebody, and you can sort of tell that person's feeling badly, or even if they're not, somebody says something and says, have you thought about, and not just, hey, you might get sued for that, but just, have you thought about the impact that might have? And it's really sad because we're in this horrible climate right now, as Meredith just brought up, where it's become politicized. Sexual harassment is a political topic now.
I think our kids, I hate to say it, but like time changes things, right? And, my child is 15 and a half. And so, from my little one down to John's 10-month-old, right? That our kids are so much more open-minded now and are being frankly exposed to these things and learning about these things at a younger age than we ever did. And that'll continue because people are, the idea about transgender or non-binary is not a hidden secret. There have been transgender and non-binary people throughout history. There have been gay men, lesbian women. There have been all of these things throughout history, but we are talking about it now more. And so can we ever stop this? The answer to that is clearly no. But the question was, what can we do to curb this? And I think, time, education, a willingness to love each other and to be open-minded about it. And as our parents' generation die off, and then as we die off, and then our kids hopefully will pass it on to their kids, I think the world will be a better, slowly, incrementally is how we'll get this changed. And unfortunately there is no panacea, and we're not just going to change it overnight. So hopefully through the work that John does in terms of training and helping his clients, because I know that the defense work is not just after we file a lawsuit. I know they are constantly doing better trainings and better harassings. I mean, I've had friends who used to call me up 10, 15 years ago, and they'd be like, I just sat through the funniest sexual harassment training I've ever seen. And it was like a joke, but I think they've evolved now and they're better. And it's not just a check the box. I think more companies are taking these types of endeavors seriously, frankly, because they see that it affects their bottom line. And so because there has been a willingness on behalf of the NBA or Coca-Cola or other large organizations to be like, we're going to pull our event from you, or we're going to do something, that it sort of trickled up, if you will. It's been a true grassroots movement. And I think we'll continue to see that.
I think younger generations already have very significantly different norms. And so, for instance, in Juan's friend's example, where they were asking, well, which one of you is dominant, et cetera. I mean, I think a lot of young people today would ask, why are you applying heteronormative gender roles to this, to our relationship? And they're very comfortable with that language. Younger people are, and don't make those same assumptions. So I do think.
Yeah, they're going to be a sophomore next year in high school, and I've gotten that. Why do you need to gender them? Like just about a car that drove by or something like that. And I'm just, we were trying to figure out who it was, and they're much more cognizant and aware and open than I was at 16. So
do you think though that this is sort of an LA bubble?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I wonder about, because Martin, I was smiling while Martin was talking, and my oldest is in 6th grade, about to start 6th grade. And of all of my kids, all 17, 18 of them, however many I have, to them, same-sex marriage and same-sex parenting partnerships is not even noteworthy. It's not even a blip. But I do wonder, having grown up in Missouri, whether or not this is a coastal phenomenon, and I don't know the answer. But the one thing I wanted to say to David is, David Phillips, not only, David, would I think a younger person be willing to counter that sort of really, I hope anachronistic, but really vulgar dialogue that Juan was describing, but I would also encourage, I harness my character defects in those circumstances, and I don't look at the people in the room and say something that's productive, like, oh, we really shouldn't engage that dialogue. I look at them and say, take that shit out of the room if you want to work here. So I just pour a little bit of rage out on them, and then I go home and I'm nicer to my family because of it. But if those of us who are my age are willing to sit there and look at other men who are, and it's usually men, behaving badly, and say that nonsense does not fly, period, get out of this room, and be a little assertive, a little aggressive about it, man, you change atmospheres quickly.
I really think that's essential, which is the bystander complex, is when you see it, you say something, because that's how somebody realizes, because they're not even thinking about it. And the other thing, not to dampen the enthusiasm about the younger generation, but a lot of the cases that I mediate are not older people. It's, a 30-year-old harassing a 20-year-old, or they're roughly the same age. And that's really discouraging, because I was really hoping that as a society, the younger people were outgrowing this, but there's a huge segment that are not. So I don't know if anybody else has had that kind of observation. I don't know, David, if you're seeing those kind of cases. I'm also seeing a lot more pregnancy discrimination cases than I used to see. Anyway, David?
I echo one thing. It's interesting, because I think on the training, I really do think the bystander training is critical. And it's so funny, like, when the legislation came out and bystander training became a thing, like my first reaction was, where the heck have we all been for the last how many years? Why wasn't this a thing before? Because I do think that this is a difference. There's a difference between the efficacy of bystander training and the typical harassment training. The typical harassment training is training people to do what we've already told them to do. They just don't do it because they don't behave. Bystander training is different. I do believe there are a lot of people that want to help that don't know how, and they're afraid, and they just don't have feel the power to speak up. John, we all know, is kind of important at his workplace. John saying, behave this way, and there's the door, that carries a lot of weight at John's firm. But I think that, the day-to-day employee that doesn't have the power to necessarily speak up and doesn't feel because of their role in the company to speak up. Look, if someone behaved that way in my workplace, they would be told exactly that, and they would have the door immediately. But it's really easy for me as the boss to say that. The bystander training, I think, is so critical to give those that don't necessarily have the power position the tools and the understanding and the confidence to speak up. So I really think that's a key component that hopefully will start changing behavior, because at least it will give someone the tools to speak up.
Any other thoughts on how we can nip this in the bud? So somebody touched on this about education at an early age, and Meredith, maybe you can talk about this because this is your profession, but training parents and teachers and others to do something from the get-go so people understand the effects of bullying, the effects of harassment.
Well, I think the biggest point is role modeling, right? It is the biggest way children learn. They don't learn from words. They learn really from watching their parents and what they do, and people in the community and what they do. So if somebody said this, we do what we say, and not, we don't say one thing, but actually act in a different way. That is going to be very, very important, because we learn through observation. We don't learn as much through training. You get a video, you watch something, okay, it goes in one ear, out the other. We're experiential learners, right? So we watch others' experiences. And then, as far as advocating for ourselves, one thing as a therapist, it's very hard to advocate for someone else if you can't advocate for yourself. So advocating for other people means that you have to come from a place of confidence, and you have to come from, maybe a place of power, a place where I could advocate for myself in this situation, so I could advocate on somebody else's behalf. But if we're not, creating an environment where employees feel confident internally, they're certainly not going to be able to advocate for others. And that's the reality. I see that all the time in therapy. They don't speak up for themselves, and they're not going to speak up for someone else. So I think role modeling is going to be really important. That's what parents, that's what they do. They're role models. Whether they understand that their child is unconsciously or consciously watching what they do, they're paying attention.
It's interesting. I had a case a few years back where we had 5 women who were being harassed, and then a guy who actually went to HR and said something. He got fired.
Wow.
But that's really rare. And we actually ended up getting the EEOC involved, and they actually brought an action against the company. And then I represented the guy and the 4 women. But it was a really interesting case, but I think that's fairly rare. Have any of you handled cases where somebody's been retaliated against for standing up for somebody else?
Yeah, it happens. Usually you wind up having both cases is when it happens. So there's one that jumps out of my mind where it was a woman that complained about sexual harassment to HR, and then the HR woman was like telling the owners, you need to do something about this. This isn't okay. And they both got fired. But again, I feel like we're on a repeat. It goes back to the culture and the education and the training and stuff like that. And so I think that, we started out with Meredith's great presentation and talking about, why don't men speak up? And really the problems are sort of the societal cultural problems, and we're never going to stop these things. I don't believe there'll ever be a cure, or where we'll live in a society where there'll be no discrimination or no harassment. But I just hope that it's less, and that people are more outraged, the way John was talking about, when they see it happening. But that's not my lifetime for sure. But I think that, it goes back to, I think that idea goes back to the bystander thing also, in regards to when you see something and it's not right, say something. And I think David deRubertis hit on this too, is it's easy to do that when you are in a position of power. It's harder to do that when you aren't making as much money and you live paycheck to paycheck, and finding a job is tough. Finding a good job is even harder. Finding a good job that pays benefits and gives you time off is 10 times harder than that. And so there's a lot of people that don't do anything out of that fear. And I think that's sort of the next societal cultural step, is when do we as, government, in terms of policy and things like that, provide more leave, provide better pay. We'll start to see some of those changes now, with people like not just taking jobs, but I think all of those things, the power dynamic and harassment, and the power dynamic comes in with the bystander as well. So
I think the cultural shift sometimes is evident too in humor. Eve, somebody that who works with me, came in to tell me that she was pregnant, and I told her that that was very disappointing and that I was going to have to fire her. And she looked at me and said, "That is the nicest thing you've ever done for me." And we both laughed and started talking about how big the annuity would be. But just the fact that was the humor about the situation, I think, is evidence of how much the environment is shifting.
Hey, John, don't reveal our settlement. It's confidential. Joke, obviously.
All right, anything else anybody wants to add? And do we have any questions from the audience? It looks like, let me see.
Say one thing, because Juan shared with us that, very candid experience of being accused. And I also just wanted to say that's often how people who are accused of sexual harassment feel too. So that's one thing. As a mediator, you honestly have to be prepared to deal with that and to talk them through it. And obviously I'm not prejudging anything. Like sometimes maybe they didn't harass, or maybe sometimes I didn't see the ways in which they did. But I will tell you, it's very common. Defendants of harassment will say, I didn't do anything. I mean, that is not an uncommon experience.
So we do have a question from the audience. What are some investigative tips you guys have when investigating claims of sexual harassment? John?
Well, I would suggest, I need to ask a bunch of clarifying questions, but I'm just going to assume for purposes of this question that you're talking about from a lawyer's perspective and you're investigating a matter that has become a claim or pre-claim. Number one, early is better, and early and often. You want to do as comprehensive an investigation as possible, even if the matter is pre-administrative claim, pre-lawsuit. Number one. Number two, you have to harness curiosity. You've got to ask lots of questions. You can't take the narrative that you're being given at face value. You have to challenge the individuals that you're interviewing. Number three, I think it's always helpful to interview in as comfortable an environment as possible. And that can be from the physical environment to the individual that's conducting the interview. We're really very fortunate in my department to have every conceivable gender, color, race, religion, national origin represented. And so sometimes in a very, what I think is a very transparent, ham-fisted way, but seems to work anyway, we'll match interviewee with interviewer to create a cultural comfort, a greater an atmosphere which is going to be more conducive to people being forthcoming. What are the other tips? Those are the ones that pop into my mind now. The idea is to not, what I see, approach it from the opposite perspective, which is what do I see that's bad? Almost all investigations that I am asked to review are bad. It's shocking how bad they are sometimes. And generally speaking, it's because they were cursory. There was no one harnessed their own intellect to figure out what needed to be done or asked. And late, obvious individuals not interviewed. Again, that goes to the comprehensive nature of it. But you need to, when you're in there interviewing somebody, you need to be asking all the sorts of questions that are going to come up in a deposition later. And if you don't know it in the investigative phase, you're not going to come to a good conclusion.
Yeah, I think John's answer is the lawyer answer from the lawyer's perspective. And I think a lot of employers out there, when you're dealing in real time and they're trying to sell their widgets and make their widgets, these are distractions that they don't want to deal with. And so they get cursory attention because in their mind, it's not significant enough. And so I think the biggest flaw that I've seen is the failure to follow up with witnesses. And that goes like to what John was saying about the cursory nature and the taking off your hat. I mean, how many times have you hired an investigator and they write a script of like 10 questions and then you get their report back and it's just an answer to each question? And in my mind, I'm like, did you ask this follow-up? Did you ask that follow-up? Did you ask this follow-up? Because, when you get someone to trust you and they start talking with you and sharing with you, you learn so much more. And I don't need I don't want to check the box interview, which I feel like so many of these investigations are. Oh, well, we interviewed it and we couldn't, they are few and far between, but I would say 90% of the investigations I've seen are, we were unable to determine one way or the other. We couldn't substantiate it. And that's punting, and that's not okay. I think employers sometimes are afraid to make a call, or they're afraid to sort of rock the boat when they really just should, and like make a judgment call about who they believe and what they believe. But I think that entails doing a John Barber investigation. Now
watch David Phillips' head, my dear old friend from his Gordon Reese defense days. Watch his head nod. Martin raises a great point. For those of you that are defense lawyers, you better be talking to that investigator. If you hire a third-party investigator, which I encourage you to do in many, many instances, most obvious reason is so you don't disqualify yourself from participating as defense counsel. But you better be talking to that investigator throughout the investigative process, because the dumbest thing I've ever seen, and I've seen it twice, believe it or not, is an investigator who writes a report that concludes that there was a violation of law. At that point, David deRubertis and Martin Aarons call you up and they say, at this point, let's just have a dialogue about how much punitive damages are going to be, because you've got a report that stipulates the liability. So for those of you that are defense practitioners, if the investigator calls you 75% of the way through and says, I got to tell you, I'm going to find there was a violation of company policy, which, by the way, is the only negative conclusion that should ever be reached. Not that there's a violation of law, but that there was a violation of company policy. You may very well make a strategic decision to resolve that before the investigator completes his or her investigation. So my master's level tip is, while the dialogue between you and the investigator is going to be discoverable to the extent that the investigation becomes an element of your defense, you nonetheless need to be having a dialogue throughout where the investigator is telling you what he or she is seeing during the investigation, because you do not want to get a phone call at the end that tells you findings before you have a chance to intercede.
Good point.
One of the other things I find that investigators forget to do is ask for documents, text messages, emails, because that's typically what ends up deciding a case. So we have come to the end of the program. I don't know if anybody's got an additional question, but I want to thank everybody for attending and thank my panelists very much. And please stay tuned for more programs that the Committee on Empowering Women for the Beverly Hills Bar puts on. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you. Thank you, Eve.
Good night.
All right, good night.